Imagine walking through Rome's quarter of pleasures, past crowded doorways and the smell of wine and oil lamps, when a familiar face turns in the lamplight. The features are delicate beneath cheap paint. This is not a common worker in a common house. This is Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife to Emperor Claudius, moving through the night as if anonymity were a thrill and danger a kind of proof. She was not a desperate woman forced into shame. She was the most powerful woman in the empire, slipping out from the Palatine to measure herself against those at the very bottom of the city's order. In public, she was ceremony. In private, she hunted an edge. Rome praised virtue with marble and punished scandal with whispers that moved faster than the Tiber. The empress was expected to embody a model so strict that rumor alone could shake a government. That is why her double life was not merely shocking, it was dangerous. The contrast between the formality of day and the risks of night became a fault line that ran straight through the heart of the imperial house. Years earlier, when Rome celebrated what looked like a perfect imperial marriage, the stage had been set. In a year counted not by the clamor of wars but by a wedding feast, Messalina, about 15 years of age, married Claudius in a union that flattered every ideal Rome claimed: noble blood, fertility, continuity. He was older by 13 years and physically limited in ways modern readers would recognize from afflictions of the nerves and muscles. He seemed grateful, and she seemed ideal, poised, graceful, and in the eyes of those who recorded such things, beautiful in the classical manner. She bore him children and stood beside him at rites with practiced dignity. Yet behind stone walls a different narrative grew. At first the clues were small, guards dismissed at unusual hours, the empress leaving her rooms in plain garments that dulled recognition. What began as a young woman's urge to breathe outside the choke of palace rules hardened into something methodical. She watched the workers of Rome's shadow economy, learned their patterns, their streets, their clientele. It was not idle curiosity, it was study. During a winter festival when Rome's world turned itself upside down for a handful of nights, roles loosened and masks multiplied. As Claudius kept the expected rites, Messalina removed herself from the script. Disguised as an ordinary citizen, she went to the quarter where habit and hunger met. A meeting was arranged with the keeper of a house. He did not know whom he admitted. He thought her an aristocrat chasing an adventure. What followed should have been forgettable. A powerful woman tasting a forbidden life and then retreating to silk and ceremony. Instead, the night became a test she refused to end. She worked past the hour others stopped, again and again demanding another encounter, as if each one were a rung on a ladder she had decided to climb to the top. When morning forced the closing of doors, she had measured herself against the hardest edge she could find and found it insufficient. The damage to more than reputation had already been done. She had discovered a lever. In the months that followed, impulse turned into design. She built a small, trusted network among palace servants who could ease her in and out unseen. She designed disguises that altered her bearing as much as her face and layered false identities until the city's night could fit her like a borrowed cloak. But simple repetition did not satisfy. Competition called to her. She began to stage private trials of endurance against famed courtesans, wagering fortunes on her capacity to outlast and outnumber. These were not secrets kept in a single room. Word drew the wealthy the way a flame draws moths that should know better. At one notorious gathering, she challenged the most celebrated professional in Rome to a contest that stretched from sundown to sunrise. The rule was simple. Whoever received the greater number before dawn would claim the victory and the gold. Nobles crowded the place as if a new kind of arena had opened. The professional paced herself with the experience of years. By dawn, she had reached a count that exhausted even her, 25, and declared herself done. Messalina refused to stop. Even when triumph was secured, she insisted on more, driven by a compulsion that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with surpassing a limit. Accounts would later whisper that the tally passed 30 before there were no more to tally. Celebration did not follow. Silence did. Rome understood it had seen something not easily named and not easily dismissed. The shock of that night is not the point. The pattern is. Messalina was not acting from need. She was choosing humiliation as sport and then as strategy. The greater the gap between her public sanctity and private degradation, the sharper the thrill and the stronger the lesson it taught her. Shame is a tool, and in careful hands it can be turned outward. From there, her nights took on the shape of a plan. She mapped the city's appetite and its fear. She watched who looked too long and who looked away. She learned that information rides on pleasure and that secrets loosen when people believe they are unseen. She turned the skills of observation and organization that might have built a better court into a private engine of control. What began as a hidden life at the bottom of Rome's hierarchy started to reach up toward its summit, where decisions were stamped and futures arranged. In the day, the Empress still performed the role Rome demanded. She appeared at sacrifices with the right expression. She hosted with grace. She spoke in the measured tones of someone who knows how much a single word can cost. But at night, the city became a diagram she could redraw. Her disguises were costumes, yes, but they were also rehearsals for a different kind of authority, the power to set terms, choose opponents, decide outcomes, and erase witnesses with the simple force of fear. The palace began to sense changes in the air, servants more careful with their eyes, officers more rigid with their schedules, a hush that fell faster than it ought when certain names were spoken. Those close enough to see patterns pretended not to. Those brave enough to ask questions learned to stop at the first answer. The weather of a court changes before anyone admits a storm is coming. By the time Messalina's private contests had become the worst-kept secret in certain circles, she had already stepped beyond contest into system. The next move would not be a night that ended at dawn. It would be something that did not end at all, something that folded secrecy into policy and turned private vice into public leverage. The streets of Rome had taught her what she needed, that shame can be harvested, that records can be kept without ink, and that power in the dark can tug the strings of power in the light. What grew next did not begin with a decree. It began with a room arranged for conversation and ended with a network that reached into Rome's most guarded circles. Messalina chose targets with care. She watched senators who liked to linger after ceremonies. She noted commanders who drank a little too quickly and merchants whose smiles hid debts. Invitations followed, private suppers in a villa that looked like any other seat of taste and learning, music, wine, and the ease that comes from being among peers. Then a narrowing of the night toward rooms without witnesses. The design was simple because simple designs are hardest to break. Participants believed they were attending refined entertainments. Only later did they realize that the doors had closed in a way that kept them from any exit but one. The host knew that shame binds faster than rope. Names were never written, and yet nothing was forgotten. A servant behind a screen, a doorkeeper who heard every whispered promise, a confidant who reported the exact moment a mask slipped. Each detail became a thread held in a careful hand. Messalina's method was not anger dressed as pleasure. It was administration dressed as indulgence. She converted risk into leverage. A senator who had mocked the emperor in a careless hour found a bill come due in the form of a vote he could not refuse. A general who boasted too freely learned that his next posting depended on silence. A trader who dodged taxes discovered that a contract of stunning value could appear if he agreed to forget something he had seen. No guards needed to draw a sword. The pressure was quiet and constant, like a weight set upon the chest. The cruelty of the system lay not only in what it demanded, but in what it broke. Bonds of trust among Rome's elite began to fray. A man could not be certain whether the companion on his right was present by choice or by compulsion. A woman could not be sure whether a smile across a table hid a threat woven from the night before. Families learned to speak in half-sentences. Friends tested one another with small risks to see who flinched. Public life continued with the same pageantry as before, but the music was a little off, as if one instrument had slipped out of tune, and, with it, the rest. At festivals dressed in reverence, Messalina found a second stage. Rites began as they always had, with incense and chant, with proper forms observed. Then, little by little, the line blurred between ceremony and spectacle. What was presented as ancient practice acquired a burnished novelty. Participants were moved from outer courts to inner rooms under the pretense of tradition. By the time anyone understood, they were already woven into scenes that didn't match the virtues celebrated in public. To protest would have meant confessing. To confess would have meant ruin. In these gatherings, humiliation was not an accident. It was the point. Messalina understood the arithmetic of shared shame. People who have fallen together are less likely to accuse one another. She arranged pairings that turned rivals into co-defendants, allies into liabilities. She pushed the powerful to cross lines they had drawn for others, and to do so where eyes could see enough to bind them, but not enough to free them. The result was obedience that did not require guards at the door. Each participant became the warden of the next. The reach of the scheme widened. Not all who appeared in those rooms were seasoned in politics. Some were young, sons and daughters of houses that had long served the state. They were told that participation proved loyalty, that older forms demanded new vows, that Rome itself required sacrifice of a different kind. They entered as dutiful children. They left as instruments of their parents' silence. In this way, a private vice evolved into a public mechanism. To oppose the Empress would be to expose the future of one's own line. Outside the villa, signs of strain accumulated. Foreign envoys reported negotiations that turned strangely pliant without clear cause. Military promotions fell to candidates whose competence was less obvious than their connections. Trade privileges flowed toward men whose accounts had once been suspect. None of this could be traced to a single scroll or seal. That was the strength of the design. It did not need formal orders. It fed on the space between what could be proven and what could be feared. Messalina's confidence grew with every success. The night taught her that secrecy is not the only shield. Spectacle can be a shield as well. She began to set grand entertainments that mimicked holy festivals, timed with care, peopled with the great and the near great, arranged so that excess could be excused as tradition revived. The progression was deliberate. First the safe rituals, then the ambiguous additions, then the acts that could not be named without breaking the room in two. When dawn came, the city pretended that nothing had happened. Pretending became policy. Even those who understood the danger hesitated. To challenge the Empress openly, one needed more than courage. One needed to survive the admission that one had been present, had watched, had not left, had accepted the cup and the music and the moment that followed. The trap worked because it used pride against itself. Men who ruled legions could not bear to say in public that they had been made to dance like novices before an altar that was not an altar at all. Meanwhile, the line between private and public blurred within the palace. Messalina valued information more than ornament. Servants who proved attentive were moved into positions where every small discovery could be carried to her ear. Scribes who kept clean accounts were rewarded with tasks outside their usual scope. Guards who stayed silent were promoted where silence mattered. Bit by bit, the imperial household tilted toward someone who was not the emperor. And then, as happens when appetite learns it can dress itself as law, secrecy ceased to satisfy. Messalina began to stage displays that no longer relied on hidden doors. She used the language of piety to gather the very people whose names had once been protected by parchment and rank. The gatherings were choreographed with a precision that would have honored a battlefield. Entry and exit, sequence and cue, witness and proof. It was the same engine as before, now running in open air beneath the awning of respectability. What remained constant was the arithmetic. Shame multiplied into leverage. Leverage multiplied into control. Control multiplied into the illusion of permanence. Those who had once believed their dignity to be unassailable learned that dignity, too, can be taken apart, piece by piece, with a smile and a toast and a door that closes gently. Power, once it learns to move without resistance, demands a larger stage. Messalina's hidden network matured into something bolder, a private house that looked like a salon and functioned like a trap set for Rome's decision-makers. It sat within a short ride of the marshy edge of the campus, shielded by taste and guarded by habit. Entry required neither password nor writ, only the confidence of those invited. That confidence was the first thing taken. The operation drew on the city's hierarchy in a way that changed its nature. This was not a den crowded with strangers. It was a room arranged for the well-born, a room where rank lowered its voice and secrecy did the rest. Women of high houses appeared not as ornaments, but as instruments compelled beneath the surface by debts and threats that never reached the street. Men of rank arrived under the pretense of fellowship and left with their futures narrowed to a single obedient line. It was a market in which the currency was not coin, but compromise. Every meeting produced something to be used. Words that should never have been said became handles that could turn a person one way or another. A promise murmured in comfort became a bit in the mouth. The staff learned to record without ink. A cough at a door, a nod at the right moment, a tray set down where it could hear. No scroll advertised the harvest, yet the granary filled. This is how the machine altered Rome from within. A senator who might have argued for a rival policy learned to agree without a fight. A magistrate who might have prosecuted a friend of the house learned to delay without explanation. A commander who might have asked for supplies at the wrong time learned to make do. The wheels of state turned, but the hand on the crank had shifted, and few dared to say so. Spectacle followed secrecy, as surely as shadow follows sun. Messalina discovered that public rites could be tuned like instruments. She took established festivals and advanced them by degrees into performances that served her wider aim. Guests were told they honored gods and ancestors. They followed the steps as they had since childhood. Only after the steps changed did they see the new dance they had learned. The shock came too late. To protest would be to expose oneself. To expose oneself would be to fall. Her calculus was simple and terrible. Humiliation shared becomes a wall that locks from both sides. She paired enemies and allies, superiors and inferiors, until each was tied to the other by what they could not say. Young people were drawn in under the banner of duty. The sons and daughters of the state taught that loyalty required acts they could never confess at home. Parents felt the ring close. To protect a child, they must protect the one who had arranged the harm. Silence thickened into policy. Abroad, those who dealt with Rome noticed the change before Rome admitted it. Negotiators found senators strangely pliant, then brittle without warning. Generals who once inspired confidence looked away at key questions. Merchants with old reputations for cunning gained new privileges without the usual explanations. The city's face remained the same. The muscles beneath it twitched. Then appetite stepped beyond the screen. Secrecy was no longer enough. Messalina staged grand entertainments under the color of piety, not in back rooms, but in spaces large enough for rumor to do the work of a herald. The sequence never varied. Start with forms everyone respects. Introduce elements that seem harmless. Escalate to actions that cannot be named without tearing the veil. By dawn, Participants had become accomplices. No decree was issued. No edict was needed. The fear of confession policed the empire more cheaply than legions could. At the center of this widening circle stood a man who, for a time, believed himself chosen. Gaius Silius was handsome and rising, a senator whose prospects shone even without the favor of the palace. He entered the empress's orbit as many did, drawn by proximity to power and the intoxication of being singled out. What began as dalliance became instrument and then became something messianic in its ambition. In a year recorded by Rome's clerks with a steady hand, while the emperor tended the grain routes beyond the Alps, Messalina crossed a line that none had expected to see, crossed in daylight. She arranged a marriage not of metaphor, but of law, complete with witnesses, rites, and contracts written as if the world could be remade by fiat. She still wore the title of Empress. She now wore the ring of another man. The contradiction was not a rumor, it was a fact. Rome reeled. The implications were clear even to those who preferred not to calculate. If the Empress could set aside the Emperor in everything but name, then names themselves had lost their power to bind. If she could anoint a new center in the person of her chosen man, then the center was anywhere her will declared it to be. Silius, flattered into the role at first, felt the ground tilt. He was not ascending a staircase. He was being lifted over a gate into a courtyard without exits. The celebration became a siege with wine. Days lengthened into a ritual of defiance. Allies looked for signs of permission that never came. Enemies searched for the point at which outrage could be made safe. Messalina, who had built a private empire by using what others would not speak aloud, now spoke through ceremony itself. The message was simple. The order you trust exists at my pleasure. News reached Claudius in a rush too tangled to be believed at first hearing. He was not a man praised for speed, but he understood danger when it stood in his doorway. Proofs piled, witnesses, contracts, the brazen pattern of acts that could not be waved away as slander. He turned his face toward Rome and came with loyal troops, not to argue, but to end an arithmetic that, left to run, would divide the state into pieces. The confrontation did not become theater. It was short, it was final. Those who recorded it saw defiance and then fear, the hard glaze of someone who realizes that a web spun for others can also wrap the spider. The sentence was carried out as sentences are when an empire wishes to steady its breath. There was no speech that could save her. Afterward, the punishment extended beyond the body. Names were chiseled away. Faces were hammered flat. Memory itself was sentenced, the old Roman rite that denies the dead their place in public remembrance. Damnation of memory is a paradox. It declares that someone will not be remembered, and by the force of the declaration ensures that they will be, if only as a hole in the wall where a portrait once hung. In that absence, Rome tried to teach a lesson, that scandal is swallowed by order, and that the state can unwrite what a person has made. But absences have edges. People cut themselves on them and learn to ask why the wall is smooth where it should be carved. The machinery she built did not vanish with her last breath. Some parts were dismantled at once because fear commanded it. Other parts lingered because convenience excused them. Habits survive reforms with ease. A servant trained to listen does not forget how. A clerk taught to keep two ledgers does not forget where to hide the second. A senator who has learned to bow in the room with no windows does not straighten fully in sunlight. Thus the empire learned again a lesson as old as power, that the methods used to control enemies will sooner or later be turned inward, and that the debt one writes for others may be presented at one's own door. The names change, the arithmetic does not. After the sentence came the work of erasure. Crews moved through halls with chisels and wax, softening letters until they could no longer be read, smoothing faces until they were only ovals of stone. Records were amended in neat hands. Banquets were whispered about as if they had never happened. Names that had opened doors now closed them. The palace adjusted its gait as a wounded animal does, favoring one side while pretending to walk as before. Positions changed quickly. Those who had kept quiet at the right moments found themselves promoted to places where quiet remained the coin of the realm. Those who had watched too closely were moved farther from the center. Claudius, who had been made to look slow by those who mistook caution for weakness, gathered officials who could be trusted to value procedure over thrill. Protocols were rewritten in ways that seemed small: who could enter which room, when guards were relieved, how invitations were issued and accounted for. Yet each small change was a thread sewn to another until a new cloth covered the old scars. Damnation of memory did not simply scrape her from stone, it attempted to untie her from time. The state declared that she should not be spoken of, that the portrait should be dust, that the gaps should be plastered and painted. But forgetting is not obedience, it is an act that requires training. People remember absences. A blank space on a wall draws the eye more than a busy fresco. A missing name in a list makes the list hum. Children ask why, and the answer is a story no one is supposed to tell. So Rome learned to speak around her, the way one speaks around a wound. Courtiers used phrases that could mean many things. Priests added a breath when they recited forms that had once included her presence. Scribes left margins a little wider than the page demanded. Citizens who had nothing to do with palaces learned a different lesson: that the state believes it can decide not only what is lawful, but what is remembered. They understood, as all people eventually do, that the desire to control memory is the last refuge of a power that fears its own reflection. And yet the most enduring pieces of her work didn't live in marble or law. They lived in habits. A servant taught to listen kept listening. A clerk trained to keep two versions of the truth did not forget where the second copy goes. A senator who had been turned by shame learned how easily shame can turn others, and carried that knowledge forward even as he claimed to despise it. Institutions molt, but they rarely shed the skin of convenience. The quiet administration of humiliation, once built, does not vanish. It waits for a new hand. Outside the palace, the city resumed its rhythm because cities must. Grain still moved from port to market. Water still sang along the aqueducts. Children still raced on stones older than their grandparents' names. The quarter of pleasures lit its lamps each evening. The Palatine slept under a watch that now counted its hours more carefully. Rome looked the same in daylight. Night remembered different truths. Those who had been harmed were not asked to speak. They seldom are. Some found safety in silence. Others carried their stories like a small weight in the mouth, swallowed each day, and returned the next. Families repaired what they could. Some marriages bent and did not break. Some friendships learned to live with a seam running through them. The city's grief was not theatrical. It was the grief of a place that knows how to bury and keep walking. What does an empire learn from such a passage? It learns that a single person can tilt the floor beneath many feet. It learns that spectacle can do the work of secrecy, and that secrecy can be made to look like piety. It learns, again, that tools fashioned to master enemies will be used on friends, and then on the hand that holds them. Above all, it learns that no decree can unwind what a season of practice has taught the human heart. Power copies itself in the dark. So does resistance. There is also a quieter lesson, one not written in edicts. It is the lesson of those who refuse to be only material for someone else's design. The guard who looked away at the right instant, the servant who mislaid a list, the parent who found a reason to go home early and take a child along. Small acts do not stop a machine that claims permanence, but they keep a space open in which permanence can be questioned. They make room for the next morning. In the years that followed, the narrative simplified for public use. Rome prefers clarity in its myths. The tale became caution for the ambitious, proof that excess ends in ash, that the city can correct itself when frightened. But beneath the public version, more complicated truths persisted. That shame is cheap and powerful, that systems built on it last longer than anyone admits, and that erasing a name does not erase a pattern. The order restored after a scandal bears the shape of the scandal in its rules. Everyone who lives under those rules learns a little of what happened, even if no one says the word aloud. Imagine, then, a room where a portrait once hung. The plaster is smooth. The light falls just so at noon. Visitors pause without meaning to, the way the body pauses at a cliff edge. A guide speaks of other things. Outside, the city breathes. Somewhere, a singer warms a voice for a rite the calendar requires. Somewhere else, a child traces a finger along a line of letters and asks why the alphabet skips. The answer comes in a softened voice, because sometimes stone forgets what people remember. At the end, what remains is not a verdict passed by a senate or a chisel's mark in marble. What remains is the recognition that power will always try to make the future obey the story it tells about itself, and that the cost is often paid by those who are not invited to speak. The work of telling, plainly without thrill or hatred, refuses the last wish of such power, which is to be the only voice in the room. A name can be struck from a wall. A lesson cannot.